Hi everyone, welcome to my sewing studio. I'm Lisa from Pink Hollybush Designs. Today we are talking about piping and specifically 5 ways you can incorporate piping into your next sewing creation. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, piping is a way to just add a little of a couture touch, a more professional finish, and just elevate your sewing project to look a little bit more expensive, a little bit more professional, a little less handmade in the negative sense of the word. Okay, so now that I've convinced you want to try piping, what do I mean when I say piping? Well, I am not talking about the packages of piping that you purchase at your regular sewing store. Those are wonderful for a home deck project, possibly for outerwear, but the proportions of the piping is just too large for your everyday garments. And so you want to use what I'm going to call mini piping. Now, mini piping is made using piping cord that is a 1/16 of an inch or 1.5 millimeters, and I will link below to the piping cord that I use. I also have a complete tutorial on how to make it, and I will link to that both above and down below. Okay, so now that we have our piping and we know how to make it, how do we utilize it? So my favorite way to utilize piping is to use it to emphasize the style lines. This is especially helpful when you're sewing with a print. So if you look at this pencil skirt that I made, it has side panels. And with the print, they would just get lost. You wouldn't even know that they're there. But because I piped them in the black piping cord, you don't even notice the pipings there, but it lets your eye see the design details. Now in this orange and blue plaid top that I made, it stands out a little bit more because of course I used the contrasting piping. It just shows up a little bit more, but again, because I've piped the style lines here, you can really see them, and that probably would get lost and you wouldn't notice them in the top because of the busyness of the plaid. But this let me use this fun plaid fabric, but also just emphasize those little design details. Okay, way number 2, or reason number 2 you might want to use piping is to add a pop of color. Again, the top, the orange and blue, you can see I added the pop by picking up the blue from the print and putting it in. I've also used it in this little children's dress. So I piped the collar with the orange and I piped the sleeve with the orange. Subtle, adds that little pop of color, which is fun. Now, way number 3 you might want to use piping is to finish an edge. And again, I have a whole tutorial that I will link to on how you can finish that edge if you don't have a lining, so that you can't insert the piping between the lining and the edge. But I've used the piped and bound edge to finish the cuff of this little dress. You can use it to finish really any opening. So I did the cuff. If you weren't going to put on a collar, you could use it to finish a neckline. You can also use it to finish the edge or the hem edge. The other thing that's nice about this is, of course, an alternative would be to use a bias binding, but a bias binding is going to be wider. So maybe you want to add, you want to finish that edge, you want to add a little pop of color, but you don't want as much color as a bias binding would give you. the piping lets you use a really subtle color edge and finish it, but not have that width and the as stand out as much as a bias binding might. Okay, way number 4 that you might want to use piping is to hide your lining. So when we have a lining, even if we understitch, sometimes the lining still creeps to the right side. Well, if you pipe it first, that piping acts as a fence or a barrier. The lining just can't come to the other side. Instead, that piping stands in between the fashion fabric and the lining and just gives you that clean, professional finish. So, of course, you can do it in a contrasting so that you're adding that pop of color, but you don't need to. As I did here with this Johnny, you can see I've piped the whole neckline in the same cell's fabric. It's very subtle. It keeps the lining from showing on the right side, and it also gives that really crisp, professional finish. It took me just a couple extra minutes to actually pipe the edge. So, and a few minutes, of course, to make the piping, but I just love the finish I got. Okay, my 5th and final reason you might want to use piping is if you're a smocker. And if you are a smocker, you're probably familiar with using piping in between the smocking and the other, whatever you're joining it to on a dress or jumper, whatever you're making. But you might not have thought of, why are we doing that? Well, there's a couple reasons. One, the piping helps support the smocking, which can be heavy. So if, for example, in a little girl's dress, you're joining that piping to the yoke, you're joining the smocking to the yoke, the piping helps that yoke support the smocking, not stretch out. But the other thing it does for you is create visually that perfectly straight line. If you try to just join the yoke to the smocking, getting it so it's perfectly straight, so visually when you look at it, your top row of smocking is the exact same distance from the seam, is very hard to do because you're having to sew it right sides together. But when you put the piping on, you're putting the piping directly on the smocking, so you can line it all up, get it exactly where you want it, and sew it down. Now you go to join the yoke, you have a line to follow, and that you created when you stitched the piping. Everything lines up beautifully, and you're not pulling your hair out. So I hope that you have enjoyed my 5 ways to use piping, and I hope you give one of these ways a try in your next sewing creation. If you like these videos, remember to hit that subscribe button and to like it. I appreciate it, and happy sewing.